Carol Possein with the Marin World Affairs Council, and I'm pleased to be here this afternoon for our online presentation with Amy Zegart. Please note that on May 18th at 7:30, we will return to the Dominican University for a presentation by Professor Andrei Trikhinkov, an expert on Russian affairs. You can learn more at the Marin World Affairs Council website. Today, we are very pleased to present Amy Zegart, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Professor of Political Science by courtesy at Stanford, and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Dr. Zegart is an expert on US intelligence and security and has been featured by the National Journal as one of the 10 most influential experts on US intelligence reform. She just published her 4th book on the topic, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The History and Future of American Intelligence, which I highly recommend. If you have a question during Dr. Zegart's presentation, please ask it in the Q&A on your computer. Dr. Zegart will speak for 35 minutes, followed by Q&A for 25 minutes. So over the last 10 years, intelligence has changed radically. Today, there's an abundance of information on the internet, satellites, cell phones, social media, etc. There's real information and misinformation. Our adversaries can hack our infrastructure and nuclear weapons controls and hack into our intelligence. A teenager can track our planes and weapons, and our politics are corrupted by misinformation delivered by social media. Our intelligence has been turned upside down. With this in mind, how can our intelligence agencies best serve America now and in the future? And we welcome you, Dr. Zegart, to speak to us about this crucial topic.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. It is just a delight to be with you, although we're on Zoom. I wish we could be there in person together, but I'm really excited to talk about my new book. Thank you for showing it in front of the Zoom computer so people can see it. And it's just a real delight to be able to talk about a topic that has become so relevant and in the news today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I'm going to touch on that in my talk as well. Let me share my screen. So I have some slides. And there we go. So what I thought I would do is start with an event that happened as I was finishing this book over July 4th weekend in 2020, because I think it captures just how radically our geopolitical world is changing and intelligence is changing along with it. And so here's the moment. So it's July 2nd, 2020. And it's about 2 a.m, and a fire breaks out in Iran. And the flames of this fire are so bright, they can be detected by a weather satellite from space. Now, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization at first downplays this incident, and they release the photo that you can see on the computer screen. And you can see from the photograph that it looks like it's a pretty ordinary looking building, and there's not that much damage. It's just sort of one corner in the front of the building. Now, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran calls that building an industrial shed that's under construction. And it says that this incident that affected the industrial shed was really limited in its damage. Pay no attention to the industrial shed. But 2 people named David Albright and Fabian Hines quickly discover a very different picture. Now, neither one of these men is part of the US government. They work for different non-governmental organizations focused on nuclear proliferation. Neither one of them holds a security clearance. Neither one of them is an intelligence officer. And only using publicly available information like this photograph released by the government of Iran and commercial satellite imagery and their home computers or their own computers, they quickly geolocate the building and they conclude that Iran is lying. This is not an industrial shed under construction. It's a centrifuge assembly facility at Natanz, one of Iran's main nuclear facilities. And the fire was not small. It was in fact quite large, most likely caused by an explosion and possibly the result of sabotage. So David Albright and Fabian Hines go on Twitter. Remember, the fire starts being detected by a weather satellite in space at 2 a.m. By mid-morning, their analysis independently, where they're releasing what they're finding, their analysis on Twitter is picked up by the Associated Press. By the afternoon, it's now a major story in the New York Times. By evening, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is asked about the shed fire and this analysis in a press conference. And he's asked specifically whether Israel was responsible for an act of sabotage of Iran's nuclear program. I don't address these issues, Netanyahu replied curtly in characteristic fashion. Now, the thing to notice about this event is, number one, all of it happened in the course of a single day. It happened very fast, much faster than typically we would think of in government intelligence agencies. Number two, all of it involved openly available information, not classified intelligence, not secrets, openly available information, what we call open source intelligence. And number three, all of this happened outside of the US government. Now, I'll share with you another picture of the same building. This is a few days later, commercial satellite imagery. You can see now from above, much more extensive damage to that building, occupying a much larger share of the building. Just to give you a sense that a picture is not really a picture. There are lots of different angles. And this is, again, commercial satellite imagery, not spy satellites, right? Not high-level government capabilities, but just readily available commercial imagery. This is just one example of a radical new world that we confront today with intelligence. Now, it used to be that tracking dangers like illicit nuclear programs was the almost exclusive province of governments and their spy agencies. But that's not true anymore. Now we know a whole host of emerging technologies, from the internet to commercial satellites to artificial intelligence. A whole host of these technologies are creating a moment of reckoning for US intelligence agencies. And I argue in the book, it's a moment of reckoning akin to 9/11, a massive need to adapt to this new world, or our intelligence agencies are going to fail. Just to give you a couple of examples of this radical new open world, the last time Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the best intelligence of Russian troop movements did not come from secrets, it came from selfies. Russian soldiers, like many young people their age, like to post selfies of themselves on social media for their family and friends. And those photographs had Ukrainian highway signs in the background and timestamps on the photographs, revealing a lot more than clandestinely acquired intelligence at the moment. We also know the bin Laden operation wasn't discovered by Pakistani military in 2011 when our SEAL team went over the border, but it was discovered by a local IT consultant living in Abbottabad who heard strange noises outside his bedroom at 1 a.m. And he started tweeting about what he heard. And he ended up live tweeting the bin Laden operation. So the Pakistani military didn't see it coming, but if you were following on Twitter, you'd have an inkling of what was going on. We see this also with Russia's current invasion of Ukraine. If you pick up the newspaper today, you'll see satellite imagery of troop movements. You'll see satellite imagery in the New York Times, before and after photographs of the horrific atrocities committed in Bucha, right? Which is verified by satellite imagery of what happened before and now what is available today. So we're seeing this play out in real time in Ukraine. This is a different world, and we need to make sense of it. But before I delve more specifically into what I call intelligence 2.0, right, how technology is challenging intelligence, I want to spend a little bit of time on intelligence 101. What is intelligence? How do we think about intelligence? Why is it always more difficult than the movies lead us to believe? So if we think for a minute, we know that spying is as old as warfare. The first surviving or known intelligence reports were chiseled on that clay tablet 3,000 years ago, and they reported both internal threats to the pharaoh and external threats to the pharaoh. We know that Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War in China thousands of years before the American Revolution. And if you're interested in American history, I have one of my favorite chapters of the book is looking at intelligence history. And I became a bit obsessive about the American Revolution and how espionage played a role in that too. So if you think that information warfare is a function of the modern era, think again. Benjamin Franklin was the master of information warfare back in the day. He was a printer by trade, and he set up a print shop in his Paris basement during the Revolution, where he literally cranked out fake news reports with fake ads and fake stories to inflame opinion in Britain and in France to help the public and the elite side with the Americans in the war. So we know that intelligence is old, that it's always been a part of statecraft and trade and conflict. But we don't actually know much about how modern day intelligence agencies in the United States work. Now, I did a number of national surveys that showed most Americans have no idea what our 18 spy agencies of the United States government do or how well they do it. I'll give you just a couple of data points that will perhaps disturb and alarm you. In Congress today, there are more experts in powdered milk than US intelligence. Right? There are more members of the Congressional Dairy Caucus. They have to know about the dairy industry to get reelected by voters back home than there are members of Congress who have ever served in an intelligence agency before. We also know that professors don't typically study intelligence either. I'm a political scientist, and so I took a look at counting the number of articles in the top 3 political science journals in the 15-year period after 9/11. This is a very important period in American history. We had a lot of intelligence controversies, a lot of intelligence in the news. Think Iraq WMD, 9/11, detention and interrogation programs, Edward Snowden and his revelations about NSA surveillance programs. And so when I counted up those articles, I found nearly 3,000 of them written by professors. And of the nearly 3,000 articles published after 9/11, only 5 covered anything related, even tangentially, to US intelligence. And since professors teach what they know, most top universities aren't teaching any classes about US intelligence either. And so this is a slide I just gave to my own students at Stanford last week, which got them to chuckle a little bit. It's a leading question. Which U2 is top at more top 25 universities ranked by US News and World Report? Well, the answer is U2 the band, not U2 the spy plane. I counted up the number of courses taught by the top 25 on the history of rock and roll, and there were more of the top 25 that offered courses on rock and roll than any courses on US intelligence. So we have an education gap in this country. Most Americans, I found, get their information about intelligence from spy-themed entertainment that has a whole host of challenges. We don't teach it in most top universities. High school AP courses actually don't teach much about intelligence either. And yet intelligence has never been more important. So we have this gap. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, was a book that I hope my students will read, and I hope their parents and grandparents will too, to try to begin to address this education gap. But that raises the question, well, what should we know about intelligence? And so let me take a minute to talk about what intelligence is and what it isn't. So we often hear in the news and in the movies, how come intelligence agencies got this wrong? Why couldn't they see the fall of Afghanistan sooner than it happened? But intelligence is not a crystal ball. What is intelligence exactly? The simplest definition is that intelligence is information that gives policymakers decision advantage. And by that, I simply mean we know intuitively that the more and better and faster information that policymakers have, the more likely it is that they'll make good decisions. Not always, right? Policymakers can still make bad policy choices, but generally speaking, the better information we all have, the better the odds are that we'll make good decisions. That's decision advantage, understanding what's happening in the world better and faster than adversaries do. It enables policymakers to have more options and make better decisions. But we know intelligence isn't a crystal ball, and yet we expect it often to have crystal ball-like performance. And the reason intelligence isn't a crystal ball is number one, it's almost always based on tiny fragments of information that may or may not lead up to a bigger picture. Information is also usually incredibly ambiguous. So when Vladimir Putin's troops were massing on the Ukrainian border, it was clear to the world that the troops were there. What wasn't clear was what Putin's intentions were. Was he going to invade? Wasn't he going to invade? Was he trying to get leverage in negotiations for Ukraine not to declare neutrality with respect to its NATO membership? Same thing happened with the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein's tanks were clearly massing along the Kuwaiti border. The imagery was crystal clear, but there was a big debate inside the intelligence community about what that movement meant. Was Saddam trying to get leverage in his negotiations with the Kuwaitis because they were involved in a major oil dispute at the time? Or was he actually preparing to invade? Some intelligence analysts believed Saddam was bluffing. Others believed it was preparation for an invasion. But the point is that smoking guns are almost never smoking guns. A picture can often have many interpretations. A piece of data can have many interpretations, and that makes intelligence difficult. Then the third factor is adversaries, because of course, intelligence agencies aren't just collecting information, they're collecting information from countries and leaders that are trying to deceive us. They're trying to hide what they're doing in that nuclear centrifuge assembly facility, for example, in Tehran. And they're trying to send foreign intelligence services astray. They're trying to deceive. And so intelligence is not a crystal ball. Now, intelligence also is not policy. And this is something I think my students have found to be a surprise. Intelligence officers are not supposed to walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, our intelligence assessment says this, and therefore we recommend you do X, Y, and Z. Intelligence has to be neutral. It has to be and be seen as being objective. And so intelligence officers are not supposed to have a dog in the policy fight. And that's what gives them credibility to speak the truth as best they know it to whoever happens to be in the Oval Office or in positions of power. So intelligence is not policy. That's not to say that it's always a clear dividing line. I did a book talk with Condi Rice here at Stanford a couple of weeks ago, and she read aloud that section of my book because she disagreed with it. And her argument was that intelligence invariably shapes policy, that selecting what items intelligence officials bring to the president and his senior advisors directs policymakers in some places instead of others. And so it's a little bit murkier in real life than I'm making it out to be. But the point is that intelligence and policy are not supposed to be the same. And then the third and final thing to remember is that intelligence has never been just secrets. So yes, there's a lot of openly available intelligence today, but even in the Cold War, public estimates were about 80% of information in a typical intelligence product came from publicly available information. So if all of that's true, then the next question is, well, why do we spend roughly $85 billion on intelligence anyway? If most intelligence comes from publicly available information, what makes intelligence more valuable than what we can get from a Google search? And the answer, I think, really hinges on three unique attributes of what our intelligence agencies in the US can produce or contribute. The first is that intelligence agencies have to tailor the information they provide to a policymaker's needs. They have to answer the question the policymaker has in the time horizon the policymaker needs. So a commander in the field in a tank needs to know, is that bridge ahead going to hold my tank? And that commander needs to know it now, right? Before it's too late. What are Putin's aims in the negotiations with Ukraine? Our officials need to know that information at the time of relevance, not a year from now, not a month from now, but now. Even longer term questions, why is China dramatically increasing its nuclear arsenal, as we now know from discoveries of nuclear missile silos in the summer? Policymakers need to understand what that could mean, or more broadly, how is the cyber threat landscape changing and what should policymakers do about that? So Google spits out the same answer to everyone, and policymakers need intelligence to answer the questions they have and the time they need it. So that's the first unique value added of intelligence. The second is what is often called speaking truth to power. And that is intelligence officers have to answer questions that policymakers may not have thought to ask, and they have to provide information that policymakers may not want to hear. Again, we see this playing out in Ukraine today. There's a lot of discussion in the news about how Putin may not be getting the real deal from his own intelligence advisors about how the war is going in Ukraine. It's hard to speak truth to power in a democracy. No one likes to say things the boss doesn't want to hear, but it's even harder to do that in an authoritarian regime when you may be locked up or executed for giving the boss some bad news. That function, though, that speaking truth to power, telling the truth as best you know it, even if a policymaker doesn't want to hear it, is an essential role that intelligence officers play. And then third and finally, intelligence synthesizes the secrets with the openly available information, because the goal of these agencies isn't just to provide secrets. The goal is to provide insight to policymakers so they can make better decisions. And it's the marriage of the publicly available information with the document stolen from a prime minister's safe, or the human on the ground who can tell you what a leader is thinking or what the discussions have been. It's that marriage that makes intelligence so valuable. So that's what intelligence does and why it's hard in the best of times. And now what I'm going to argue is intelligence is even harder today, thanks to what I call this moment of reckoning. That what we've seen in the past decade or two is the emergence and convergence of a whole host of technologies. More than half the world is online. We have artificial intelligence, we have quantum computing, we have synthetic biology, and more. We've never had so many emerging technologies changing so much so fast. And for intelligence, this convergence of new technologies is driving what I call the 5 mores. And I'm going to go through each one of these. But just very briefly, technology is creating more threats that intelligence agencies have to track, more speed at which intelligence agencies have to operate, more data that intelligence analysts have to contend with, more customers who don't work just inside the US government who need intelligence today, and perhaps most interestingly, more intelligence competitors in a world where anybody can gather, analyze, and disseminate information. So let me take each one of the 5 mores for just a minute. The first more threats. This is, if you looked at the Cold War, and if we were having this conversation in the 1980s, and we were to talk about what are the top 3 threats confronting the United States, the answer would be the same: the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union. Today, though, the threat environment is much more complex, and it's driven a lot by new technology. So cyber threats in particular are giving old adversaries new capabilities, and new adversaries capabilities that only powerful countries used to have. If we think about, for most of American history, there were 2 key things that protected this country: power and geography. The United States military being powerful, our economy, its power, gave the United States the power and security to protect our interests, our people in the world. And our geography was beneficial too, those 2 vast oceans separating the United States from the dangerous neighborhoods in the rest of the world. But those 2 things, power and geography, do not protect us in cyberspace. The United States is one of the most powerful cyber actors in the world, and we're simultaneously one of the most vulnerable cyber countries in the world, because we rely on digital connectivity for so much, for our economy, for our Zoom, for our education, for our society, for our military. And because we're so digitally connected, we're vulnerable. So power and vulnerability in cyberspace go hand in hand in a way they never did in physical space. And we also know that there are no vast oceans protecting us in cyberspace. The good and bad neighborhoods are all connected because the internet wasn't ever designed to be secure. So cyber is really changing the game of the threat landscape. The second more is that intelligence agencies have to operate with much more speed than they have in the past. So intelligence has to move at the speed of relevance for policymakers to use it. And that's changed dramatically. So I always say that you can't get a PhD in political science unless you talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I'll mention the Cuban Missile Crisis just for a minute. If we think about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, John F. Kennedy had 13 days between the time he got the intelligence from those famous U-2 photographs flying over the western edge of Cuba that clearly revealed Soviet nuclear missile installations, 13 days between the time he got the intelligence, assessed its implications, and announced what he would do to the world. Fast forward to 2001, President George W. Bush had 13 hours between the time of the first terrorist attack, analyzing the intelligence and deciding what his policy announcement would be to the country. Today, it's more like 13 minutes or 13 seconds, or maybe we're too late because cyber attacks are often inside our systems for weeks or months before they're ever detected. So the second more is more speed. The third more is one that we all live with, which is more data. Intelligence analysts are drowning in data. More people today in the world have cell phones than running water. The amount of data on Earth is estimated to double every 2 years. And what that means is that intelligence is looking for needles in haystacks, and those haystacks are growing exponentially. That's a big challenge for intelligence today, driven by technology. The fourth more is technologies are giving rise to more people who need intelligence but don't work inside the US government. So voters need intelligence about election interference. And what I have on this slide is a public service announcement by the leaders of a number of different agencies. And the very stern-looking gentleman in the top right is General Nakasone, who is the leader of US Cyber Command and the head of the National Security Agency. So voters need intelligence for elections. Tech leaders need intelligence about cyber threats to their system. Critical infrastructure industries like financial services also need intelligence to protect their businesses and to protect American national security. That's a very different world for intelligence agencies that are used to producing only for people with security clearances, now having to produce for the open or unclassified world. And then finally, the fifth more competitors. So spying isn't just for governments anymore. And I have a chapter in the book that's dedicated to looking at how this new world is playing out with nuclear threat intelligence. Who's doing it outside of the US government, and how are they using publicly available information to analyze the most secret of threats, which is proliferators that are trying to hide what it is that they're doing. And so I liken this world to the Star Wars cantina. And when I told my friends in this nuclear threat space, they said that they liked being compared to the Star Wars cantina. And the reason I use the Star Wars cantina as the image is that this emerging ecosystem of people outside the government conducting intelligence collection and analysis really runs the gamut. It is people from all walks of life, lots of different countries with a wide array of motives and capabilities. And I'll just give you a sense of two to give you just a little bit of a feel for how wide ranging this ecosystem is. So the gentleman with the red shirt is my Stanford colleague, Dr. Sig Hecker. And Sig is a nuclear physicist and the former director of Los Alamos National Lab. Now, for years, he had a security clearance, but he no longer does because he's tracking illicit nuclear activities using only openly available information. And he's found very valuable intelligence or information that he's shared about North Korea's nuclear weapons program in particular. And you see here a New York Times story about Sig written by the great David Sanger. The guy on the right is also part of this open source nuclear threat ecosystem. His name is Jacob Bogle. He's a rare coin dealer. He lives in Tennessee, but he's an obsessive map maker that's his hobby. And so he's put together a really good map of North Korea, and he's obsessively interested in updating that map. That gives you a sense of the range of people that are now involved in this world. And if we take a step back, what I have in this slide is just how do we compare the organizations and the sort of universe of people operating with publicly available information compared to the secret information of the US intelligence community. If we look at this open source intelligence world, we see that the objectives that people have are really diverse. Some really want to have funding for their nonprofits. Some very much believe in informing the public. Some are just hobbyists. Some are activists. Some are journalists. Some are profiteers. Some are volunteers. It's a wide array of people. Membership is completely open. All you need is an internet connection and you can participate too. Their backgrounds are wide ranging. Their product quality control is ad hoc. Anyone can post anything, right? There's no rigorous process of fact checking before something is posted online. And it moves very fast. Think about David Albright and Fabian Hines and that fire in Tehran. One business day was all it took for their intelligence to go viral. Now compare that to the intelligence bureaucracy of the United States government. There, the organizational objectives are much more focused, right? It's decision advantage. People in these intelligence agencies are all there to provide decision advantage to policymakers. You can't join easily. You have to go through a lengthy security clearance process. You have to be vetted. It takes about 2 years, even now, to join the Central Intelligence Agency. So it's not open to anybody. The backgrounds of analysts are invariably narrower than a rare coin dealer and a nuclear physicist. There's peer review. There are bureaucratic processes. Red tape is not all bad. Before something gets disseminated, it has to be reviewed. It has to be checked. It has to be peer reviewed. And so that doesn't mean intelligence is always right, but it does mean that there's more standardization to quality control. And the ecosystem inside the US government, we know, moves more slowly than it does on the outside. So very different worlds now coexisting together. Now, what are the benefits of this new open source intelligence world of individuals and organizations operating without security clearances? I think there are 3 big ones. The first is more hands on deck. There are more people who can put their brains and their talents behind trying to understand what's going on in the world. The second benefit is that because this information is unclassified, it can be shared more easily, shared within the US government between agencies, because classification often maroons information in different agencies. So if it's unclassified, it can be shared within the US government and between countries. And it also offers more diverse perspectives. And, you know, I always think a joke is worth 1,000 words. So we all know the saying that the optimist sees the glass as half full and the pessimist sees the glass as half empty. But for engineers who are tuning in, you'll know that engineers like to see the glass as twice as large as it needs to be, the benefit of alternative perspectives. And it's really important to have that in intelligence analysis. The open source community can provide that. But like anything in intelligence, there are also risks to this new world. The first risk is that errors can go viral. And when they do, they can take the most important thing in Washington, which is time. It's attention. So the more that intelligence agencies have to debunk erroneous open source intelligence, the less time they can spend doing their primary mission. And we can talk about this if you want in Q&A. This is not a hypothetical problem. This is actually a problem that has already happened with open source intelligence in Washington. The second risk is deliberate deception. Because this world is open to anyone, nefarious actors can inject disinformation or deceptive information in the hopes that it will get picked up and used inside policymaking channels. And then the third real risk is that crises can become harder to manage. Open source intelligence can actually force transparency and make crises even more difficult to manage because everything's out in the open. This may seem counterintuitive. Isn't transparency and speed and openness always a good thing? And the answer is no. And so just to give you a sense of it, think for a minute about this hypothetical. Imagine it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's playing out right now on Twitter. So I put a tweet on my slide just to set the stage, just in newpeoplesat.com images show nuclear missile sites in Cuba, # crossing red lines. Now, we know from the actual Cuban Missile Crisis that the two most important ingredients to averting nuclear war were number one, secrecy to compromise, and number two, time to think, right? Secrecy, not transparency, is what enabled John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev to agree to a missile trade. The Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba. The United States withdrew nuclear missiles from Turkey. A deal so secret, nobody knew about it for more than 2 decades. Secrecy, not transparency, proved crucial to resolving that crisis. And time to think proved crucial too. Had Kennedy made his decision on the first of those 13 days of the crisis, he would have launched an airstrike, which was much more likely to lead to nuclear war. So third-party transparency in this open source world and the fast speed at which open source intelligence moves is not all a good thing. Let me end with, what does this mean for US intelligence today? I believe that our intelligence agencies have to be radically reimagined for this new technological moment in 3 primary ways. The first is they need to be reformed to understand emerging technologies better. How are they changing geopolitics? How are they changing American capabilities relative to the rest of the world? The second is, how can our intelligence agencies use new technologies and this open source intelligence better? Secrets still matter, but they're not all that they used to be. We need to be much better at harnessing insights from openly available data. And then the third is, how can our intelligence agencies work better with this emerging organizational ecosystem of open source intelligence sleuths around the world, so that their quality control is better, their ethical standards are clearer, and they can verify themselves what they're doing rather than burdening or taxing intelligence agencies to take on that role. Let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions and conversation. I think, Carol, you're on mute.
There we are. Thank you, Amy. We have quite a few questions. Talking a little bit more about the future, one listener asked, should we reduce or consolidate the 18 intelligence agencies? And what else would you recommend as far as changes?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I'm going to give what is probably an unsatisfying answer, which is, I think we have too many agencies and not enough agencies. What do I mean by that? I believe that we actually need a 19th intelligence agency that is dedicated to open source intelligence. And I say that knowing that coordination is always a problem in intelligence. And I've done a lot of work criticizing our intelligence community. We have too many agencies, it's too hard to coordinate. But the one thing that I've learned in doing research for this book and in intelligence for a long time is that secret agencies prize their secrets. And so, as one of former official told me, we think if a piece of information costs $1 trillion to get, it must be worth $1 trillion. And so open source or free information will never get the attention that it deserves. And I think it's foundational today in intelligence. It will never get the attention it deserves as long as it's sort of a second-class citizen inside secret agencies. So yes, we need some consolidation, but most importantly to me, if I could do one thing, I would create a new dedicated open source intelligence agency for the US government.
Are there any other major changes that you would focus on, for example, oversight?
So I think oversight is a perennial and systemic problem. And there are reasons why Congress has done such a poor job of overseeing the intelligence community. And the main reason is they don't get rewarded for doing it well. So one of the reasons I care so passionately about educating people about intelligence is that if voters care about intelligence, members of Congress will care about intelligence. But right now, voters don't care much. They don't reward their members based on how they deal with intelligence oversight. And so it should surprise no one that most members of Congress don't spend a lot of time on it. So we have to have vigorous oversight, not only to make our intelligence agencies accountable, but also to make them effective. So one of the things I noted, I wrote a book about 9/11. In the decade before 9/11, the least reformed part of our intelligence system, and even after 9/11, the least reformed part was Congress. Congress never asked how well our intelligence agencies were adapting to the end of the Cold War. They didn't ask hard questions about what the FBI needed to make intelligence and counterterrorism match the priority that it was given back in 1998. In congressional hearings, they didn't ask the right questions. And so the oversight function failed. And it's one of the reasons why our agencies adapted so poorly to the terrorist threat before 9/11.
Mhm, mhm. What about the any reform in the area of recruitment? We need tremendous amount of expertise with cyber,
Yeah.
and we have so much competition with private industry.
I'm so glad you raised that because at the end of the day, I talked a lot about technology, but Carol, you're so right. It's about people, right?
Mm,
People are the long pole in the tent. And
mm,
and we don't have enough computer scientists already just to fill the jobs that exist in this country. And now, as you know, in the Bay Area, there's just stiff competition. But I'm ultimately an optimist when it comes to recruitment because at least, I teach a lot of Stanford students and I'm teaching them right now. And what they care most about is impact, right? They don't care most about money for the most part, but our STEM, our computer science majors, they want to make a difference in the world. And the problem is they feel like they can make a difference faster and better outside of the government than inside the government. So I think our intelligence agencies need to do a much better job at making it easier for people to come in, enabling them to have impact, making it easier for them to go in and out because most folks don't want to be lifers today. They want to go in and out of different careers. And I think that's possible. I think this generation really cares about the world. And it's up to our government agencies to do a better job at marketing and recruiting them. But it's
mhm,
possible.
mhm. I have a couple of anonymous questions here. What do you think about American and Russian intelligence involved with Ukraine? And also, what do you think about the anonymous hacker group that claims to have hacked Russia's security agency and multiple Russian agencies and companies?
Big questions. So I'll stick with the US intelligence piece of it because I think it's really interesting. And for those who are interested, I wrote more extensively about the declassification of intelligence with respect to Russia's invasion in the Atlantic. I wrote an article about that. I think it's a really novel strategy. We've never seen so much intelligence declassified so fast and so persistently as we have. And as intelligence officials will tell you, that's a hard thing to do because intelligence agencies, for good reason, don't want to reveal what they know because they don't want to risk the sources and methods, right? They want to keep the collection streams going. And when you say what you know, an adversary can start to figure out how you know what you know and shut those sources down at risk to humans that if they're human sources providing intelligence. So normally intelligence isn't revealed like that. But I think the Biden administration did it. And I think it was a very clever strategy. And I think there were three goals. The first is information warfare. What the Biden administration essentially did was get the truth out before the lie, right? The declassified intelligence said, don't listen to what Vladimir Putin's about to tell you. He's going to lie. He's going to tell you he's not going to invade Ukraine, and he is. Don't believe the con. And so this enabled the truth to get out before the con. And I think it helped actually rally the allies. And I think it helped Biden make his case for NATO coming together. So information warfare was a key battleground. But the second reason I think, or the second goal, I think, was to introduce friction to Putin. So the more that Putin, a former KGB man, is stewing in his juices about how do the allies know what they know? Who can I trust? What technical systems can I trust? The more he's off his front foot, the more he has to worry about himself and the less he can do damage abroad. Now, he's obviously committed atrocities, but imposing friction on an adversary is almost always a good thing. And I think this served that purpose too. And then third and finally, I think when you remove the narrative, the fig leaf that Putin was trying to provide, it makes it harder for third-party countries to sit on the sidelines. Countries like China, harder for them to actually perpetrate the narrative that Putin has released to the world. They're still doing it, but they're raising the costs for third-party countries to sort of stand on the sidelines. So I think it's all three of those things. I think the first part has been pretty effective. As for Anonymous, You know, it's interesting because Anonymous has been pretty quiet for a while. Have they succeeded in hacking? You know, there are lots of capabilities reside in individuals and organizations. So one of the things that I think we all have to be wary of is, you know, all of our connected devices are inherently insecure, and Russia is no exception to that.
Mhm. Another question. Let's see. Wouldn't you agree that a well-placed human source who can report in a timely fashion on our adversaries' intentions can often be worth much more than a technological collection system? What is the future of human spies on the ground?
Oh, humans are always important. So, you know, a picture can tell you what a building might be, but a human can tell you what it might be for. So humans are never going to be going out of business in intelligence, but it's going to be a lot harder. It already is a lot harder to recruit human sources. Think about all the biosurveillance that exists in the world today. Think about all the cameras on the streets of Beijing, or Olympians who had to bring burner phones to the Beijing Olympics because their phones were going to be accessed by the Chinese Communist Party. That makes all of those things make it a lot harder to recruit human sources on foreign soil. So, but we're going to have to figure out ways to do it, because I think as the questioner, I think implicitly suggests, we have to have humans, right? There's no substitute for human intelligence in helping us understand adversary capabilities and intentions.
Well, how do you think the war in Ukraine and the world opinion about it might affect recruitment?
You know, it's interesting. There have been some public stories about how this could be a recruiting bonanza for the United States. So I think it was the Washington Post that had a story that the FBI was targeting ads that would show up on your phone only if you were walking right in front of the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. So, and it was a counterintelligence ad. You know, if you want to talk to the Bureau, here's the number to call. So I think there's a savvy strategy that in this time there may be a lot of concern and disagreement within Russian intelligence about what Putin is doing, an opportunity to recruit people to switch sides or to deliver some information to the United States.
Another question. Is it possible for researchers to provide a complete and balanced view of American intelligence? In my over 30-year career, I participated in a number of highly productive intelligence operations. None was ever declassified or leaked to the press. How do you research information that's classified?
That's such a good question. No, I'll never know the full picture. So I'm an outsider. I look at intelligence from the perspective of the outside, and my friends inside in the intelligence community often say, until this book in particular would say, how come you always talk about our failures and you don't talk about our successes? And I'd say, well, your failures are public, but your successes are secret. So declassify some more of your successes and I'll talk about those too. I can't give you the denominator, right? If I had to grade US intelligence, I don't know the final grade of successes and failures. So I'm very aware that I can't know the full picture from the outside. But I also think insiders can't know the full picture from the inside either. So there are benefits to being an outsider. I can ask really uncomfortable questions. And because I have tenure, I won't lose my job, right? I can come to unflattering conclusions that might be career limiting if you're on the inside. I have a First Amendment lawyer that protects my right to do that. So I hope that the intelligence community sees this as really beneficial, that outside researchers may not know the full picture, but they offer a different perspective designed to help the intelligence community fix problems and adapt better. But I do think, the questioner is absolutely right. We'll never know the full picture. And I would argue even people on the inside probably will never know the full picture of intelligence success and failure.
That's right. Now, as you said, the failures are public. And your book details the history of a lot of US intelligence failures, like Pearl Harbor, the Chinese joining North Korean troops during the Korean War, 9/11, WMD. It gets a little discouraging to the reader. And the question comes up, how do you rank US intelligence today? Are other countries ahead of us, like China?
I wish I could answer that question. It's it's my next book project, which is do it. So I've only looked at the US intelligence community. I've not spent a lot of time researching and comparing the US to other countries. I'm collaborating with Christopher Andrew, who's a well-known intelligence scholar in the UK, and a colleague of mine at Harvard named Calder Walton, and we are co-editing a global history of intelligence, where we're going to look at exactly that question. How have different countries over the last 100 years fared with intelligence? So maybe I'll be able to come back and I can answer that question when we're done.
Well, good. That'll be an invitation. Let's see. More questions. Well, I was going to ask you if we needed a new agency, but you answered that. Describe the amount of intelligence data to analyze. How does intelligence separate out what is important?
Well, that's, a bit of an art and a science, right? So it comes from requirements from policymakers that say, this is what I want to know. And then it depends on what's been collected. And then it requires creativity as well, because different signals or pieces of information taken in isolation may not seem important, but when they're added up, they are important. And I think the example that most readily comes to mind, and it's a tragic example, is the FBI's failures to penetrate the 9/11 plot in the days and weeks before that attack. So I spent 5 years researching why the FBI and the CIA failed to adapt to the rise of terrorism, why they failed to stop 9/11. And I found 23 opportunities, 23, that those two agencies had to penetrate the plot, and they failed. And one in particular, and it's about isolating those signals. So taken individually, it didn't look like anything big, but when you put them together, it might have led to a different outcome. So in the weeks before 9/11, there were 3 different FBI offices in the United States, each pursuing clues to what would become the 9/11 terrorist attack. In New York, there are special agents that have learned that 2 suspected high-level al-Qaeda operatives named Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi were most likely, almost certainly, in the United States, and they needed to be found. So they started a manhunt for these 2 men. Now, the FBI didn't know that they had been living for a while with an informant in San Diego, an FBI informant in San Diego. The FBI didn't know this. So in New York, you have a special agent doing a manhunt for these 2 al-Qaeda operatives. They would go on to fly American Airlines 77 into the Pentagon. That's New York. In Minneapolis, there's another FBI office that has arrested a man named Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker, the guy who was alarming people at flight schools, and they were trying to get into his computer. And there was a whole problem with a misunderstanding of whether the FBI could access his computer. They're worried about Zacarias Moussaoui in Minneapolis. Okay, so we have New York, we have Minneapolis, and then we have Phoenix, Arizona, where there's another special agent who writes a brilliant memo where he's reviewing files and he realizes that it looks like bin Laden might be sending terrorist operatives to the US to train in flight training schools. And he recommends a bunch of steps. So now you have a Phoenix memo, the Minneapolis team looking at the so-called 20th hijacker, and you have a manhunt in New York, and none of those offices knows about the others. And no one in the FBI knows about all 3 of those pieces. Now you can imagine if all 3 of those had come together, it might have been a stronger signal about an impending terrorist attack on American soil. So this question about things being dispersed in too many different places that we can't pull the right information, how do we know what's a signal and what's noise? Once you find a signal, you have to aggregate it. Otherwise, it comes across as a weak signal. And so it was those organizational problems, principally, I think, that led us to fail before 9/11.
Gary asked you to talk about the interaction of U.S. intelligence in the West, between Western countries, and with Russia and Chinese organizations.
Meaning, do we collaborate with Russian and Chinese organizations, or do we collaborate with our allies and partners? I'm not quite sure.
Well, talk about the collaboration with the West.
Okay. So that's gotten more extensive in the past few years. So I'm sure some of your listeners know well, there's a very close relationship with what's called the Five Eyes. So it's the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And so those 5 countries have always had a very close intelligence sharing relationship. But what we're seeing now with the war in Ukraine is that that intelligence sharing has expanded to NATO countries and in real time, near real time, to Ukraine, right? So there's a lot of public reporting about how battlefield intelligence is being shared with the Ukrainians so they can do a better job at defending themselves. And so the US is lending intelligence aid, not just military aid. So I think this is something that's going to happen a lot more in the future as we think about the value of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence needs structured data. And in order to have structured data, you want to have like-minded countries, democracies that share interests and values, sharing that structured data to make our algorithms more powerful. So I think we're going to see not just sharing of information, but sharing of data sets so that our algorithms can actually do a better job at helping analysts assess information in the future.
Mhm. Another question has come up. Has the creation of the Director of National Intelligence been a useful reform?
Oh, I just had a discussion about this with former CIA Director John Deutsch a couple of weeks ago. This is a big debate. So if you look at what I said, I was not a fan of the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. I testified before Congress, and essentially I said it was a bad idea whose time had come. And by that I meant that whenever there's a crisis, the natural inclination is to create a new agency, right, to solve the problem. But if the problem is coordination, creating a new agency doesn't seem like a good solution. So I was not in favor of a DNI. I thought the CIA director should just have more authorities to run the CIA and run and oversee other agencies. But we have a DNI. And I actually think the DNI has gotten much better over time. So we see the National Counterterrorism Center, I think, has been a marked improvement over what we had before. And we have seen, particularly in the last few years, the role of the Director of National Intelligence really consolidating and coordinating much better than I thought it would. I think we have a long way to go. The Director of National Intelligence still doesn't have power over money and people, which is what you really need in Washington to knock bureaucratic heads together. But it's working better than I think it initially did.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Talk a little, what was your biggest surprise when you were researching for your latest book? Or tell us about some of the surprises.
Well, one of the most moving things for me, and one of the things I'm really proud of in this book, is I'm an outside analyst, so I have a sort of a geeky political scientist view of the intelligence world, but I also wanted my book to enable people on the inside of this world to be heard. And so I interviewed a number of former senior officials like DNI Dan Coates, who was Director of National Intelligence, and Sue Gordon, who was his deputy and a CIA veteran. I interviewed a number of folks, and I asked them questions like, when did you tell your kids what you did? And what was their reaction? I asked them about their ethical challenges in the job. I asked them about their best and worst moments in their career. And I guess one of the biggest surprise, and I'm really proud that those voices and those answers are in this book and that they would enable me to share them. And what surprised me in the process was I didn't think I was going to get those reflections in COVID in Zoom interviews from far away. I thought it'd be much harder. But in fact, I think that COVID moment, we were also reflective and interviewing people in their own homes. It was a very personal experience for me, at least, in hearing what these former officials had to say. So that was a surprise for me that it turned out to be so moving and so personal in a way that I thought would not be because of the technology. Intellectually, the biggest surprise to me, or what I learned the most, is about this open source world, that it's not a passing fancy. It's not just about new information. It's about a whole new dynamic set of organizations and individuals that are reshaping how information flows and how it's used. And so just adding more unclassified information to intelligence is not going to be enough. So I became more radical in my calls for intelligence reform as a result of doing this research.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, that brings us to the end of the program. Thank you very much, Zegart. for being with us. And I encourage everyone to read Dr. Zegart's book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. I've read it myself, and I can say that it's an excellent review of the history and future of U.S. intelligence. You've been watching the Marin World Affairs Council. If you like what you hear, attend our next meeting on May 18th and become a member of the World Affairs Council. Thank you and good evening.